Pam Bondi's sharp critique of Jasmine Crockett marked a significant moment in political discourse, not just because of its intensity, but due to the broader implications of her warning. Bondi, known for her unfiltered and legally grounded style, did not mince words when she addressed Crockett's controversial comments. The clash began when Crockett made remarks that were interpreted by many as a veiled threat or at least an inflammatory call to action. In response, Bondi took the opportunity to outline the responsibilities that come with holding public office and the serious consequences that can follow from reckless rhetoric. Bondi's statement was clear. Elected officials must recognize the weight their words carry. She underscored that it is not merely political theater when someone in Congress makes a charged statement. It can quickly escalate into real-world consequences. Her warning to Crockett wasn't just political posturing, it was a pointed legal and ethical message. Bondi stressed that officials are not free to say whatever they please without scrutiny, particularly when their words are perceived to incite action, intentionally or otherwise. She implied that there are legal frameworks in place that can address what she described as dangerous provocations. By taking such a firm stance, Bondi positioned herself as a guardian of law and order in the face of what she views as escalating irresponsibility among certain political figures. She drew a firm line, not only criticizing the remarks, but also defending the public and industries potentially impacted by such rhetoric. Her argument centered on the idea that these kinds of statements, whether they stem from frustration, ideology, or performance, can ripple through society in unpredictable and damaging ways. She seemed to suggest that Crockett's comments had crossed a line from protected speech into territory that could be interpreted as threatening or coercive. Bondi's approach also emphasized the distinction between legitimate political dissent and reckless agitation. She did not argue against protest or criticism, those are foundational in any democracy, but she warned against the kind of language that could be construed as incitement. She implied that once words leave a lawmaker's mouth, especially when broadcast to a large audience, they can no longer be controlled or easily clarified. The damage, she said in effect, can already be done, even if the original intent is later denied or walked back. In pressing her point, Bondi cited legal precedent and the obligations of public service. Her focus was not simply on defending institutions, but also on reminding office holders that they are bound by oaths and standards that demand more than passion. They demand restraint. Bondi's criticism went beyond Crockett personally and touched on a broader trend in politics where sensationalism can overshadow responsibility. She used this moment to deliver a stark reminder that accountability does not vanish once someone is elected. If anything, it becomes more critical. The weight of Bondi's warning rested in its specificity. She was not vague or passive. She called Crockett out directly, making it clear that while heated debate is part of the political process, calls that might be interpreted as targeted or threatening would not be tolerated. She spoke of the potential legal consequences, not as an abstract threat, but as an imminent possibility if the conduct continued unchecked. Her tone was firm, unapologetic, and unequivocal. This was a line that should not be crossed. In delivering this message, Bondi also appealed to a wider audience, voters, civic leaders, and legal professionals, who she seemed to believe were watching a dangerous erosion of decorum in public life. She invited others to join her in reasserting the importance of responsible speech and conduct in public office. While her comments were aimed squarely at one individual, the underlying message was clearly meant for all who wield public influence. Her warning was as much about defending civil standards as it was about issuing a cautionary tale. She painted a picture of what happens when rhetoric escapes reason and morphs into reckless advocacy. Her position was that leaders must lead not only through ideas and policies, but also through example, especially in how they use their voices. Bondi's response was not simply reactive. It was a deliberate assertion of legal and moral expectations in an era where those lines often appear blurred. Jasmine Crockett's recent comments have ignited a storm of controversy, sparking accusations that go beyond political rhetoric and have entered the realm of incitement. Her vocal involvement in a protest movement targeting a major corporation has not only drawn widespread media attention, but has also fueled fierce responses from across the political aisle. The statement that triggered the backlash, a desire to see someone taken down as a kind of personal birthday wish, was quickly seized upon by critics as dangerous, irresponsible, and potentially inciting violence. What made Crockett's comment so incendiary was not just the choice of words, but the timing and platform through which they were delivered. As a sitting member of Congress, her words carry both symbolic and practical weight. She occupies a position of influence, with access to broad audiences and the power to shape public opinion. When someone in such a role expresses something that can be interpreted as targeting an individual or entity for destruction, the implications are far-reaching. Her critics argue that regardless of intent, the optics and potential consequences of such statements cannot be brushed aside. The backlash was swift and severe. Prominent voices in the Republican Party, most notably firebrand representatives, characterized Crockett's remarks as a call to arms, claiming they amounted to an endorsement of political violence and terrorism. These responses weren't limited to sound bites or press releases. They formed part of a growing narrative that views Crockett's words as part of a broader pattern of inflammatory rhetoric that could embolden fringe actors or violent protesters. The critics believe this sort of language, especially from elected officials, has the potential to catalyze real-world unrest. What amplified the controversy even further was Crockett's association with an organized campaign that had already been accused of promoting disruptive and potentially destructive behavior. The movement in question is known for its aggressive tactics, including coordinated protests and calls for financial divestment. While such actions fall under the umbrella of protected free speech and civil protest, when coupled with language that implies a desire for personal takedown or ruin, the line between lawful activism and incitement becomes blurred. That line is precisely where critics are focusing their concern. This isn't the first time an official's words have been scrutinized in the context of national security and public safety, but Crockett's case is unique due to the directness of her language. Unlike ambiguous or metaphorical phrasing often used in political theater, her comment was clear enough to spark alarm and provoke formal responses from both legal experts and political figures. For opponents, this clarity removed any benefit of the doubt. For supporters, it raised the issue of free expression and whether political figures are being unfairly targeted for speaking passionately. The central point of contention revolves around responsibility. Should elected officials be held to a higher standard of communication? Critics of Crockett argue emphatically yes. They point to the potential consequences of such rhetoric, not just in terms of public perception, but in the actions it could inspire. With an increasingly polarized political climate and a public more attuned than ever to perceived threats, the words of influential leaders are not just statements, they are signals. And in this context, Crockett's birthday remark became a lightning rod for criticism about the tone and temperature of modern political discourse. There is also the broader political calculation at play. Opponents see an opportunity not just to censure Crockett's remarks, but to leverage them as part of a larger critique of her political camp. By framing her comments as not just misguided but dangerous, they hope to create a narrative of recklessness that extends beyond her individual role. This is evident in the way her words were linked to a broader condemnation of the protest movement itself, which is now being painted by some as a thinly veiled campaign of intimidation. In the midst of this fallout, Crockett has attempted to clarify her remarks, suggesting they were meant metaphorically or as part of a broader message of economic resistance. However, the damage in the eyes of her critics had already been done. The moment her statement went public, it was interpreted through the lens of national security, civil unrest, and political accountability. That interpretation, regardless of her intent, has stuck. And in an era where public statements are parsed for hidden meaning and political consequence, Crockett's words became a flashpoint that reignited debates over the boundaries of political speech and the responsibility. In the aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's controversial remarks, a surge of real-world consequences has unfolded, most notably in the form of attacks on facilities associated with a prominent company at the center of the political storm. These incidents have gone far beyond peaceful protest or symbolic acts of resistance. Several dealerships have reported significant vandalism, and in some cases, the use of incendiary devices, marking a disturbing escalation in tactics by some individuals, identifying with the protest movement Crockett has been linked to. Federal law enforcement agencies have responded swiftly. Authorities are treating these acts not as isolated incidents of property damage, but as coordinated and deliberate attacks. The severity of the incidents, firebombing attempts, destruction of vehicles, and arson, has led officials to classify them under statutes dealing with domestic terrorism. That classification is not just rhetorical, it brings with it the full weight of federal investigation, prosecution, and the potential for extraordinarily harsh sentencing. Some individuals already in custody now face up to 20 years in federal prison if convicted under the charges that have been brought against them. This escalation from online rhetoric and grassroots mobilization to physical violence has alarmed both law enforcement and public officials. It illustrates the volatile line between protest and extremism. Though the majority of those associated with the movement have acted within the bounds of peaceful civil disobedience, the actions of a more militant fringe have turned a political campaign into a national security concern. Officials have emphasized that while peaceful protest is protected under the Constitution, once actions turn destructive or life-threatening, the government is obligated to act with full force to maintain public safety. The role of language in catalyzing these incidents is under intense scrutiny. Federal prosecutors have pointed to the broader environment of charged rhetoric as a possible contributor to the motivation behind the attacks. While no direct connection has been publicly established between specific statements and specific acts of violence, officials are building a case that the ideological environment fostered by prominent voices has created a permissive atmosphere for extremism. In this context, incendiary speech becomes more than just political expression. It can be seen as laying the groundwork for real harm. This has placed those involved in the protest movement under a new and more intense spotlight. Activists are now being asked to explicitly denounce the violence and distance themselves from the perpetrators. Some have done so, emphasizing that the movement's goals are economic and symbolic, not physical or destructive. However, the damage, both literal and reputational, has already been done in many ways. Images of charred buildings and burned-out vehicles have spread rapidly across media platforms, reinforcing the perception that the protest has morphed into something far more dangerous than originally intended. Pam Bondi and other officials have made it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated under any circumstances. Bondi's office has issued formal statements indicating that not only are the perpetrators being aggressively pursued, but that anyone found to be materially supporting such acts, even indirectly, could face legal repercussions. This includes individuals providing funding, logistical support, or even using their platforms to promote the actions of those involved. Her messaging is firm. There is no legal gray area when it comes to acts of political violence, and those crossing that line will be held accountable. The federal crackdown has been matched at the state and local levels. Several state attorneys general have signaled their intention to collaborate with federal authorities to prosecute cases involving the attacks on commercial properties within their jurisdictions. Governors have deployed additional resources to protect vulnerable sites, and law enforcement visibility has been increased in key areas identified as potential future targets. The coordinated response is designed not only to apprehend those responsible, but also to send a clear deterrent message. These actions will not be ignored or minimized. At the heart of this unfolding situation is a growing debate about the consequences of radicalization within political movements. While dissent and protest are core elements of democratic society, the blurring of lines between resistance and aggression raises complex legal and moral questions. Leaders and activists alike are now being asked to take greater responsibility for the tone they set and the behaviors they inspire, whether directly or indirectly. The ongoing investigations and legal proceedings promise to be closely watched, not just for their immediate impact, but for what they reveal about the evolving boundaries of protest in the modern political landscape. Amid the growing firestorm surrounding her recent comments and the escalating protests tied to them, Jasmine Crockett has stepped forward to offer a defense of both her language and her intentions. As criticism intensified from across the political spectrum, particularly from figures accusing her of inciting violence, Crockett clarified that her remarks were not meant to provoke destruction or physical harm. Instead, she argued, they were meant as a form of political expression, rooted in nonviolent resistance and economic pressure. In her words, the goal was to challenge power through peaceful means, specifically by urging financial divestment and public accountability, not through force or intimidation. Crockett emphasized that her call to take down a corporate giant was metaphorical, a rhetorical flourish aimed at highlighting what she views as systemic inequities and unethical practices. According to her, the focus should remain on mobilizing communities to withdraw financial support from institutions and companies that they believe fail to serve the public good. Selling off stock, boycotting products, and engaging in lawful protest were the tools she promoted, not violence, not sabotage, and certainly not terrorism. Her supporters echo this interpretation, arguing that framing her comments as dangerous or inflammatory ignores the rich tradition of economic protest in American history. Still, the backlash has not subsided. Opponents argue that regardless of her intentions, the language she used was reckless and easily misinterpreted in a way that might embolden more radical elements. In a political climate already marked by volatility, many believe public figures must take extra care to choose their words wisely. To these critics, Crockett's explanation sounds more like damage control than a sincere expression of principle. They point out that her remarks came amid an organized campaign that has already inspired disruptive and destructive actions, and they question whether such a movement can remain peaceful when its rhetoric veers so close to confrontation. In response, Crockett has turned the tables on her critics. She argues that the outrage directed at her is selective and deeply hypocritical. In interviews and public appearances, she has highlighted what she sees as a double standard in how political figures are treated based on their ideology or party affiliation. She referenced past incidents where inflammatory language from other politicians failed to generate the same level of scrutiny or legal threats. To her, this disparity in response reveals an uncomfortable truth about bias in both media and law enforcement. That some voices are silenced more harshly than others, not because of the content of their speech, but because of who they are and what they represent. Moreover, Crockett has framed her comments within a broader context of protest as a tool for marginalized communities. She argues that calls for accountability, especially financial accountability, are crucial in holding powerful interests responsible for their influence over public life. Her remarks, she contends, should be seen not as violent rhetoric, but as passionate advocacy rooted in frustration and urgency. She believes that her critics are less interested in de-escalating tension and more invested in discrediting dissent, especially when it comes from voices that challenge entrenched systems of power. Despite her clarifications, the controversy has become a flashpoint in a much larger conversation about the boundaries of free speech, the nature of protest, and the role of public officials in shaping political dialogue. While some have accepted Crockett's defense as a reasonable explanation, others remain skeptical, insisting that public figures must be held to a higher standard precisely because their words carry weight. The challenge for Crockett now is not only to maintain her credibility, but also to reframe the narrative in a way that recenters her original message without fueling further division or mistrust. To that end, she has begun to more explicitly denounce any acts of violence or vandalism that have occurred in connection with the protest movement. She has reiterated her support for lawful, nonviolent civil action and has encouraged her followers to stay within the bounds of legal expression. Whether this will be enough to repair the damage to her public image remains to be seen. However, her willingness to engage with the criticism and provide context for her words demonstrates a strategic pivot, a move to reclaim control of the narrative and position herself not as a provocateur, but as a principled advocate navigating a turbulent and often unforgiving political arena. The controversy surrounding Jasmine Crockett's comments and the fallout that followed has become emblematic of the larger challenges facing public discourse in a highly polarized era. Her words, whether intended as metaphor or protest slogan, triggered a chain reaction that included public condemnation, legal threats, property damage, and a national debate about the responsibilities of elected officials. It underscores how the intersection of politics, protest, and rhetoric can quickly spiral beyond the control of any one individual, becoming a flashpoint for conflict and interpretation across ideological lines. Crockett's attempt to clarify her position highlights a critical tension in contemporary political communication, the balance between passionate advocacy and responsible leadership. On one hand, elected representatives are expected to give voice to frustration, injustice, and the demands of their constituents. On the other hand, they are held to a standard that requires care, precision, and accountability. When those standards appear to be breached, especially in ways that may incite unrest, public trust can erode quickly, and political opponents are swift to capitalize on the moment. The reaction from figures like Pam Bondi and others in positions of authority reflects this zero-tolerance approach to rhetoric that veers toward extremism. By invoking federal statutes and the language of domestic terrorism, these officials sent a strong message. Protest is a right, but violence, even indirect incitement, will be met with firm consequences. This response, though applauded by many, has also been criticized as selective enforcement, prompting further division and debate over what constitutes equal justice and fair political accountability. The broader implications of this clash go beyond the reputations of those involved. It raises uncomfortable questions about the role of protest in modern democracy. When does advocacy become agitation? How do we distinguish between impassioned speech and inflammatory speech? And what responsibilities do public figures have in shaping, not merely echoing, the emotions of their followers? This episode also reveals the power and danger of language. In an age of instantaneous communication, where every word can be recorded, clipped, and shared to millions in seconds, the potential for misinterpretation or intentional distortion is immense. Politicians now speak not only to their districts, but to the entire world, and the scrutiny that comes with that reach is intense and often unforgiving. As the legal and political ramifications of this situation continue to unfold, the lasting takeaway may not lie in who was right or wrong, but in what this incident teaches about leadership in an age of hyperconnectivity and distrust. It is a reminder that the stakes are high and the margin for error is small. Navigating that terrain requires more than ideology or charisma. It requires discipline, clarity, and a deep understanding of the weight that